This is PTV World. I am Syed Shabahat Ali. You are watching Fault Lines. On 24th of February, it has been an year since Russia invaded on Ukraine. 1 year of the longest war Europe has seen after World War II. This crisis has many dimensions. On one end, this is the largest land conflict that Europe has been involved after the Second World War. On the second aspect of it comes the economy, because not only Russia is paying a huge cost of getting involved into this conflict, but also the European economies are bleeding. Millions of refugees have poured into the Western capitals. And so forth, the integration of European nation has been tested against these odds. How Russia's economy has responded to this conflict, how Ukraine is surviving this all-out onslaught, and how integrated Europe stands today after 1 year of this war being incepted. All of this in today's program. Team Fault Lines have prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
It has been 1 year since war in Ukraine precipitated. Ukraine has become the stage upon which multiple battles are being fought. Diplomatic efforts are also garnering pace as China is attempting to mediate the complicated and intensifying Russia-Ukraine conflict. Chinese top diplomat Wang Yi met with Russian President Vladimir Putin and other senior Russian officials in Moscow to discuss a range of issues, including Ukraine. China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang stated that Beijing is deeply concerned about the year-old conflict in Ukraine, which appeared to be intensifying and even getting out of control. Russia says it is studying a newly released paper on Beijing's Global Security Initiative, Chinese leader Xi Jinping's flagship security proposal. US President Joe Biden made a surprise visit to Ukraine for the first time since the full-scale war began and announced $500 million in additional aid to Ukraine, part of a growing tally of assistance in the billions of dollars that Washington has provided to Kiev. US President Joe Biden, in a meeting with 9 Eastern Europe NATO allies, has assured his ironclad commitment to Article 5 of the alliance's treaty as the leaders reaffirmed their unwavering support for Ukraine and underscored their shared commitment to stand with the Ukrainian people. Russia launched its all-out invasion of Ukraine on 24th of February after a months-long standoff that saw Moscow amass troops near the Ukrainian borders as Russian President Vladimir Putin demanded an end to NATO expansion into former Soviet republics.
Ladies and gentlemen, my first guest in the show is Mohammad Taimur Khan. He is an expert on the affairs of Russia. Taimur, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your show.
Taimur, 1 year of war has been completed. What has been the most surprising aspect of this war for you? I mean, both on the negative side and on the positive side.
Of course, 1 year of the Russia-Ukraine conflict have passed, and for me, the conflict itself was a big surprise. But however, there were several other developments during the last 12 months that were also very surprising in my opinion. The first and foremost one was the stiff resistance put up by Ukraine against Russia, because it was being predicted that Kiev would fall in a matter of a few weeks or at least a couple of months at best. But here we are after 12 months and the conflict continues to persist. Apart from that, what was surprising for me was the continued support and resolve of Ukraine's Western allies in the form of military assistance, humanitarian assistance, and financial assistance. Despite 1 year of the conflict being passed, the assistance is still there at Ukraine's disposal. Another surprising thing for me was that the survival of the Russian economy, despite the sanctions, the various packages of sanctions that have been levied against the Russian economy by the Western countries. Furthermore, the continued Russian attacks against Ukraine, even after 1 year of the conflict, because it was being predicted that Russian arsenal is running dry and it is losing a lot of personnel on the battlefield, but the Russian attack continues in an overwhelming way. Other than that, you see, for me, what is actually very surprising is the continued neutral stance maintained by majority of the developing world, despite the pressure from the Western countries to adopt a different stance as compared to the one that they are currently subscribing to. And one other surprising thing for me was the supply of the main battle tanks by Germany and other Western partners to Ukraine, because for me, I thought that Germany would hesitate for a very long time in order to provide such advanced and significant military assistance to Ukraine against Russia, but that has also started to materialize.
Taimur, you must have seen the statement given by President Biden during his recent visit to Warsaw. Let me play the statement and then I would want to hear from you. How do you comment on it?
1 year ago, the world was bracing for the fall of Kyiv. Well, I just come from a visit to Kyiv, and I can report Kyiv stands strong. Kyiv stands proud, it stands tall, and most important, it stands free.
Well, the statement of President Biden in Warsaw was actually a message of reassurances and encouragement to the European Union members, and especially to the people of Ukraine, that United States would continue supporting Ukraine in its defense against the Russian aggression, regardless of how much time it takes, and that the collective West remains united in its support of Ukraine against Russia. Apart from that, the statement was also a direct threat to Russia as well, that NATO remains intact and that its Article 5 remains very much effective, that if need be, it will be utilized. Furthermore, the statement also carried a benign message for the rest of the world as well, that the United States of America continues to remain the leader of the free world, and that it is a dependable, reliable partner for any country in the world, especially while there is a lot of talk going around at the moment which states that the global power of the United States is waning. So yes, this is what I believe was the message of President Biden's statement in Poland.
Did US and European Union or the countries of Europe pass the test of their resolve? Because all these economies have paid a very heavy cost of this conflict.
Well, it's a very good question, but it depends. That first of all, you have to realize that it is not the United States of America and the European Union who are directly fighting Russia at the moment. So their actual test of their resolve to remain united in the face of Russian aggression would be properly tested if, God forbid, if both United States and the EU are directly involved in a conflict with Russia. However, if one speaks with regards to their resolve in remaining united in the provision of financial, military and humanitarian assistance and support to Ukraine, then yes, they have passed that test so far. Although there are certain misgivings and apprehensions on part of some of the European Union countries such as Italy, such as Hungary, even to a certain extent Germany, but they have passed this test of remaining united to date against Russia. But it is still a little uncertain that this resolve to remain united would continue in the coming months, because as it has been predicted by the director of the IMF, that the European economy might go through some recession in the coming months of the financial year 2023-2024, which will also factor in majorly in the decision making of the European countries with regards to the continued support to Ukraine against Russia. So I think it is only a matter of time which would decide how things fall in place and how the decision making processes will be affected.
Taimur, the Secretary General of United Nations has recently given a statement. Let me play the statement before I take your comment on it.
We have heard implicit threats to use nuclear weapons. The so-called tactical use of nuclear weapons is utterly unacceptable. It is high time to step back from the brink. Complacency, will open deepen the crisis while further eroding our shared principles proclaimed in the Charter.
So, Tamur, you heard him. And do you believe the threat of a nuclear war is so real that the Secretary General of United Nations has to take up this matter?
Well, the concern of the United Nations Secretary General about the use of, or at least the threat of use of nuclear weapons in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is definitely not misplaced at all. I believe that his concern primarily stems from the fact that multiple times the Russian leadership has reiterated that it is going to use any and all means available at its disposal in order to defend the Russian mainland, including the annexed territories, which also includes the ones that were annexed in September last year, which included the Donbas territories as well as Zaporizhia and Kherson. President Putin has also categorically stated that if any attempts are made in order to retake those territories, then he will use any means available to him in order to protect Russian interests, Russian people, Russian mainland, which also includes the annexed territories now, by the way, which after the referendums in in October last year, have become part of the Russian mainland now. So if any threat is posed to them, he'll use any means, which also includes the use of nuclear weapons. Besides that, apart from any direct nuclear attack, the United Nations Secretary General was also concerned about the the safety of the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia region, which is now under the Russian control. So if that gets damaged, then there is also a threat of nuclear spill, and another Chernobyl-like incident can also take place. So that is why I believe that he is also concerned about any sort of nuclear threat during the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Tamur, while we were discussing about this war back in November when you were invited in our program, we were of the view that winters will serve to be the largest weapon or the greatest advantage Russia might have in this conflict. Now the winters are almost over. Do you believe anything is going to change from this point on for Russia? Have Russia been able to capitalize on the winters?
Interesting. You see, winters were not only an advantage for Russia, but they were also an advantage for the Ukrainian armed forces as well, because just as it gave some respite to the Russian forces, it also gave some time to rest to the Ukrainian armed forces, which were completely engaged on the front lines for the last so many months. But however, as the winter is slowly and gradually going away and the spring is setting in, there are now chances of a fresh spring offensive being launched from Russia as well as from Ukraine as well. The Ukrainian armed forces are going to definitely try to gain more territory and recover all that territory that was taken away from it by Russia. And Russians are also simultaneously going to try to gain more territory of the partially annexed territories of Donbas, Zaporizhia and Kherson, and move more closely towards Kiev. I also predict more violence, more attacks, and more deaths on both sides during the conflict, because now fresh aid and assistance and weapons have also poured into Ukraine. And during the winter time, Russia also got a chance to mobilize a large force into the front lines, as well as restock its arsenal to relaunch its spring offensive after the winters are over. So I'm expecting for the fighting to reinitiate, but in a more escalated and in a more violent form this time around.
How about China, which perhaps is offering a new model of engagement to Russia? How do you see this development, Tamur?
Yes, China is definitely trying to build a very strong and consolidated symbiotic relationship with Russia, especially after the publication or the release of the latest national security strategy of the United States of America, in which it was clearly stated that the United States of America considers Russia and China as revisionist states to be one of the biggest threats to its national security. So US actions and US policy orientation has definitely brought both these countries together. And after the commencement or the onset of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, both countries have also developed several complementarities in their bilateral relationship. China is an industrial giant and it requires affordable energy. After the Russia-Ukraine conflict, there is a huge vacuum in the Russian export of energy. So China is a good contender in order to replace the European market with its own market, and Russia is looking forward to selling its energy to China in order to compensate for the vacuum that has been left by the exit of the European market. Furthermore, there is also a relationship of military to military and military technical cooperation between the two countries, because both countries believe that they face a plethora of challenges which are of nature, which are of mutual concern to both these countries. So yes, both these countries are looking for building a symbiotic relationship in different fields, be it economy, be it strategy, be it political, diplomatic, or even military to military and military technical cooperation. So yes, both countries are moving forward in order to develop a very deep, privileged and a strategic relationship.
And will China ever try to provide ammunition and weapons to Russia, making itself direct party to this conflict? Do you believe this will happen?
Well, pragmatically speaking, I believe that Russia would love to get its hands on Chinese weapons and ammunition, especially microchips and semiconductors. But I don't think so that China is going to supply Russia with any sort of military hardware or equipment or ammunition, for that matter. Because first and foremost, it is not Chinese policy to be a direct party to any conflict. And I also don't think that it is in the best interests of China, either in the long or in the short term, to be a part of any armed conflict or even be a party by extension to any armed conflict, because China is economically rising still, and it will be very counterproductive for China's economic and strategic interests to supply Russia with arms and ammunition and invite the wrath of the collective West in the form of sanctions and aggressive policy orientation. Although the West still has an aggressive policy orientation towards China, despite the fact that they are also economically connected with each other, but still China would definitely like to avoid any sort of undue attention that it might invite by helping Russia out in this manner. So I don't think so that China would be supplying Russia with any sort of arms or ammunition. And apart from that, I also believe that the Russian military industrial complex is massive and is fully capable of catering to the needs of its armed forces, despite the heavy requirements of its armed forces in its conflict with Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Taimur, for being guest in my program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your show.
Ladies and gentlemen, you heard Taimur, who has a very candid view of the developments taking place between Russia and Ukraine and how European Union and United States are getting affected as an outcome of this crisis. Now, I am joined by Professor Stephen Zunes, who's joining me from University of San Francisco. He's with me over the phone. Professor, welcome to the show. First things first, the political noise inside Russia, as I was discussing a while ago with my previous guest. Do you believe there are problems being created now, or problems coming for President Putin in Russia's politics?
There is growing dissent inside Russia due to the enormous human and material costs of the ongoing war. At the same time, it's apparent that Putin is still very much in charge, that there are no prospects in the near future that he will be brought down. One of the disturbing things in terms of Russia's future is that so many of the best and brightest young people have fled. I mean, these are the people who would be the high-tech specialists, the new entrepreneurs, the artists and writers, and so many who could contribute so much to Russian society, but they are leaving in droves because they don't want to be rounded up and sent to the front. So the long-term future of Russia, particularly in light of the international sanctions and whatever happens, they'll remain an international pariah for many years to come, is not good. But again, I don't see any real immediate shift in terms of what happens in Russia.
Professor, China is also signaling to build a new model of cooperation with Russia. For many in the West, this is perhaps a signal of becoming a direct ally in this war with Russia because everyone else is supplying weapons to Ukraine, while Russia might be depleting, might be running out of its ammunition. How plausible is a cooperation between these two sides and them going forward as partners together in this war front?
Regarding China, they share Russia's concern about U.S. hegemony. The United States has been the world's one superpower ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. The United States has abused that status in many ways, from blocking the United Nations from taking action to end the Israeli and Moroccan occupations, invading Iraq, propping up all sorts of dictatorial regimes in the Middle East and North Africa and elsewhere. I mean, there are certainly very valid critiques of U.S. hegemony. And China and Russia do indeed have strategic interest in challenging that. However, supporting Ukraine against against the Russian invasion could not be considered a case of hegemony. That is quite a reasonable reaction to defend a country against a foreign invasion. The question is, how far is China willing to go to support the Russian effort? The Russians aren't winning. The Russian economy is in shambles. Does China really want to expend their resources to prop up ultimately a losing or at least stalemated effort? And given the shape of the Russian economy, the widespread corruption, inefficiencies, and everything else from both Russia's, but from both Putin's poor economic policies and the international sanctions combined, it doesn't seem like something that China, which tends to take a fairly pragmatic foreign policy, would want to expend too many resources in. So it would depend a lot, I think, on U.S.-China relations as to how far China will go in supporting Russia.
But Professor Stephen, this gives birth to a very important question. Do you see this war ending anytime in the near future? Because I think so far it's a situation of stalemate that we are observing in this war.
I don't see the war ending anytime in the near future. The Ukrainians obviously are not going to stop fighting. They want their land back, quite understandably. The Russians, meanwhile, while the Russian people, the Russian nation, doesn't have much at stake in conquering or holding on to parts of Ukraine, certainly Putin does. It's very much of a personal issue for him. He's shown he's been willing to escalate in response to setbacks, including the sending missiles into Ukrainian cities to destroy their infrastructure. There are some real risks here. On the one hand, one can make a moral and legal argument that the international community should help Ukraine fight Russia until every inch of territory is restored. On the other hand, given that there is a risk, albeit a small one, but still a very real risk of escalating to nuclear war and all sorts of other terrible scenarios, including the slaughter of people on both sides in this battlefield situation that resembles World War I in terms of its brutality of people just going over the top in wave attacks and being gunned down. I mean, it's really horrible. The question is, how much difference will it make if the final boundary is 100 or kilometers east or west of where it is now? Is it worth that kind of sacrifice? I mean, it's not like the international community has taken a strong stance against countries expanding their territory by force. I mean, look at the Israeli occupied territories, where the United States is the only country in the world that has formally endorsed Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan region of Syria. Or even worse, the U.S. recognition of Morocco's conquest of the entire nation of Western Sahara, a full member state of the African Union. So it's not like the United States really has this position that says we cannot tolerate a country expanding its territory by force. The U.S. is quite willing to do that. So here's the question. We're not even willing to use diplomatic leverage to try to end other occupations. In fact, we will send arms and diplomatic support for the occupying powers, and yet we are willing to risk World War III and all sorts of other horrific things in order to supposedly uphold this principle in terms of Ukraine. So it's really hard to say. It sounds like this war is indeed going to go on for some time, and there will be terrible consequences because Russia has the advantage in arms and numbers. Ukraine has the advantage in getting better equipment from the West and having more motivated fighters. Unfortunately, it looks like the war will indeed go on for a long time.
Thank you very much, Professor Stephen Zunes, for being guest in our program today. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with second segment of program. Stay with us. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We, before the break, heard Professor Stephen Zunes, who believed that not only United States policy is not very clear on the issue of Russia-Ukraine or not very justifiable, but also it is increasing the chances of world entering into a larger nuclear conflict. Certainly, there is an economic side of this conflict as well. And to ponder upon it, I have invited Sultan Ali Haider, who is an expert of political economy and also a strategist. Sultan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shabahat. It's always a pleasure to join you at Fault Lines. You always make some very interesting conversations.
Sultan, before we talk directly about this confrontation between the two sides, how were the economies of these two countries doing before the war started? Can you help us to have a bird eye view of Ukraine's economy and Russia's economy before the conflict began 12 months ago?
Well, Shabahat, the economies of both the countries, they were doing quite well. And especially it's very interesting if you look at the trend or trajectory. So baseline, interestingly, is 2016. Both of the countries, they really grew on 2016 levels or from the 2016 levels. And they continued growing significantly up to start of the war. That is the end of 2021. If you look at the baseline for Ukraine, Ukraine's economy was $91 billion. In 2016, it grew to $200 billion in 2021. Russian economy, it was about $1.2 trillion. And from there, it grew to $1.7 trillion in 2016 to 2022. So both of the countries were doing well economically. Now the unfortunate event and disruption of war comes in. Now, what impact it had on Ukraine economy was a lot more severe. Naturally, yes, understandable, because Ukraine has been the theater of war. War is taking place in Ukraine, not in Russia. So Ukraine's infrastructure gets destroyed, its industry gets bombed and destroyed. So as we know, it was very famous that a lot of fighting was taking place around its steel plants. So two of the steel plants, they accounted for 40% of their steel production, and those were destroyed. Its refineries got impacted. So on the industrial production side was quite severe. On the agriculture side, yes, while the production could take place, the fields were not destroyed, but trade could not happen due to the port blockade. And we know that with great difficulty and impact on global wheat prices, that thing took place. So that's on the Ukrainian side. And there's about 20-30% contraction of Ukrainian economy that has taken place post-war. On the Russian side, more of the impact was expected in terms of freezing of their assets, trade sanctions, and it was expected that currency would take a plunge and the economy would severely contract. It has not taken place to the level where it was expected. And rather the economy, due to as per certain estimates, has rather grown, enjoying high energy price levels. So we can get more into that.
And then, Sultan, my question would be, how did Russia then sustain the brunt of the war that came to it in form of economic sanctions or economic policies of the West that were originally designed to bring Russia down?
So this is a very interesting question, why Russia has been able to sustain its economy, and this is where the whole thing gets really interesting. Naturally, the Western powers thought that by putting sanctions on Russia and freezing its foreign exchange reserves, these would lead to Russia coming to its knees. Now, the story goes back, in fact, because Russia had started to, what I would say, it had started its economic pivot and started to pivot east a lot sooner. Because post-collapse of the Soviet Union, it rather started focusing on building its economy rather than focusing on its military. And so it started to develop its oil and gas industry. It started to focus more on its commodities and mineral wealth. So that was the thing that continued to develop and started to give more and more strength to the Russian economy. And while doing that, Russia started to focus more on its eastern part. So largely Russia had been focused more on its western part, which is a European part of Russia. So its thought process was more of that. Now it's due to its pivot east and towards its economy, Russia economy built up in size, and it built up its foreign exchange reserves. It continued to run what you call a current account surplus. So it kept on adding to its FX reserves every month. So what we can say is developed a significant war chest to fight in this war, number one. And number two, its economy was not dependent on the things that were really controlled by the West, except what we can say is part of its energy exports to Europe. That was the only part which was impacting Russia. But as they stopped, it could find other customers that would take up its energy. So Russia, from that angle, it's very interesting. It was able to survive the whole piece of sanctions. And one important thing is that naturally no war has taken place inside Russia. So Russia's factors of production have not really gotten impacted. It has no industry that has gotten destroyed. It has no bombing of any infrastructure, so everything is intact. So for Russia, it was much, much easier to sustain compared to Ukraine.
All right, so would you give us a sketch of the plan that the West made against Russia? I mean, in terms of economy, how did they decide to strangulate the Russian economy, which, according to your analysis, was doing quite a wonderful job before the conflict began?
All right, yes. So to really contain Russia, the Western effort on the war was that, yes, while Russia would be embroiled in the military effort against Ukraine, so initially West was not in supplying big weapons to Ukraine, and was not militarily really helping Ukraine. It went in with a three-pronged strategy. It wanted to kill the Russian trade, so it imposed sanctions on transfer of funds through the banking channels to and from Russia. It imposed trade sanctions, so Russia cannot sell its goods through which it would make money. And one of the biggest shockers that took place was the freezing of Russian assets, foreign exchange reserves that were under the control outside Russia, under the control of Western powers. Now that also had a connotation of sending a shocker to other countries across the globe that whatever their FX reserves are in control of the West, if the West freezes them, they are not theirs. So Russia had $300 billion of its reserves that were frozen by the Western powers. So the whole idea was that Russia would get blocked by that. Now, Russia has been able to sustain that, as we have discussed before. And one of the ways that Russia has been able to get out of this is that as through its Asian pivot, as we spoke about before. So one of the largest buyers, if we look at of oil and energy, one of the commodities that Russia exports are China and India. So China being number one, China and India being number three, and we can see they are the two of the biggest countries in terms of population. So Russia has been able to continually supply to China and to India. Both China and India have resisted Western pressure not to buy oil from Russia. So now further integration is happening, and through selling of the oil through land directly to China, one of the biggest markets. So while Russian supply through Nord Stream to Germany has stopped, but to China, that's beginning. So that integration also has a very, very interesting impact on the American policy or the American strength of naval blockade that can really stifle or stop the Chinese growth and to stop Russia. So that integration to the biggest market without exposing themselves to the Navy of United States and Western powers. So that's a very, very interesting play.
And Sultan, how do you believe the impact to be for Europe of this conflict? I mean, certainly Europe has already paid a heavy price, but how do you see this going forward?
Impact on Europe, it's not a very easy thing to estimate because, and we really, it's quite complex. We really need to differentiate, first of all, between Eastern Europe and the Western Europe, because Eastern Europe was historically, we know that it was behind the Iron Curtain, part of the Warsaw Pact, and allied with and integrated with economically with the USSR. Some of the countries were part of the USSR. Now, in terms of impact on those economies were struggling, so they have been impacted negatively by that. They were heavily dependent on the Russian economy and supply of commodities. Now, the case for Western Europe has been different, naturally, because in terms of Western Europe, it was again Western European economies. They also started to rely more and more on Russian energy, and a lot of new infrastructure had been built to supply the Russian oil and gas to these economies. Now, Germany has been the powerhouse, economic powerhouse for the whole world. And again, in terms of its exports, the whole energy was dependent on Russian energy. With the war coming in, there was a lot of pressure on Germany to reduce its dependence on Russian oil and gas. Largely, the reason was that Germany was supplying US dollars to Russia directly, while Russia was attacking and invading Ukraine, and that's not good. But we know series of action has taken place. Nord Stream 2 got blown up. Russia stopped supplying energy, and it was thought that during this winter, perhaps while they wanted Russia to come to its knees, maybe Russians thought that the European powers would come to its knees because of non-supply of energy and high energy prices during winter. Now winter is ending, and Europe has survived. At the same time, the 1 year impact, according to some German estimates on German economy alone, is about 200 billion euros. And it's expected that same would continue. Now, this is the economic impact, and that the people have had to absorb. Similar numbers are across other countries. That is why France was rather reluctant to get involved too much into this. Now, going forward, again, according to some German estimates, again, 200 billion euros would be the impact for the coming year. So for Western Europe, the impact has been economic, and which has impacted their trade competitiveness, which has impacted their exports to the rest of the world. And at the same time, for Western Europe, they also have to give aid to Ukraine and fund part of the military effort in terms of the military aid to Ukraine. So the impact on Europe is quite significant. And the more this war drags on, the impact is going to be greater. One, again, key thing, and that is the thing to look out in the future, in case, God forbid, this dispute escalates, is that, again, no war is taking place outside Ukraine. So if, unfortunately, it spreads, if the war spreads, then again, European infrastructure will start to get destroyed, just like Russian infrastructure can start to get destroyed if this whole thing spreads beyond the Ukrainian borders. So the impact has been significant on people, on industry, on exports of Europe, but also the impact has been limited to accommodating the refugees. But so far, no direct attack has taken place. So hopefully things can de-escalate for Europe in the future. Yeah.
And do you see similar implications for the rest of the world?
Yes, Shabahat. Yeah. So in terms of rest of the world, US is the most important stakeholder. Rather, it has been the main captain or the cheerleader of the effort to contain Russia and to help Ukraine defend itself. US has been backing them, has been cheerleading, it has been providing economic aid, it has been providing military aid, it has been asking other powers to come in and support Ukraine and to help contain Russia. One of the interesting aspects is that the whole economic impact has been felt by US and people in the US in terms of inflation, also in terms of people questioning how much aid is US giving to Ukraine, and is this a blank check, and to what extent should US be providing a blank check? One interesting number, for example, is that in this 1 year, it is estimated that about $100 billion of military equipment has been supplied to Ukraine. Now, what the US analysts have been saying that over the whole period of Afghan war, this was given to the Afghan army, a number close to it, or maybe slightly lesser than this. Now, that was over a period of maybe 18 years. Now, in contrast, with Ukraine, it has been supplied in 1 year. naturally, both of the situations cannot be compared because in Afghanistan, uh, the other side that was a guerrilla outfit. It was not a proper modern army. Yes, it was very determined and tenacious, and it had the impact of wearing down. But in terms of Russia, that Ukraine has to fight. Now, Russia is a modern army. It is well equipped, well trained, and to fight the Russian army in terms of technology, in terms of tactics, you need a very, very serious effort. So, US has had to give in this amount of aid. But the problem is that for the US, the impact is that it is escalating. And so, if this much amount of aid has gone in, now there's a talk of sending in more lethal weapons, more deadlier weapons, which would cost more money and significantly more money. So, for the US, it has that impact in terms of economic aid. Again, it has a greater impact. We see, and then there's talk of corruption maybe taking place on the ground. So we see US officials going to Ukraine, and they're talking about transparency in terms of use of that aid that US may be providing. So there are many questions that starting to take place in the United States, just like very similar to question taking place that the same amount of money that was being spent in Afghanistan or earlier in Iraq, the same hundreds of billions of dollars were used for uplift of US and US infrastructure and to spend on different things that US citizens do not get from their own budget. So US is also beginning to feel the strains of the war, while at the same time there's a lot of talk on further escalating. So US is getting impacted. In terms of rest of the world, the whole world has felt the brunt in terms of inflation due to rise in price of commodities. In terms of economists, their natural reaction whenever there's inflation is to raise interest rates, but this is more of imported inflation. It's not about local economies heating up. So there's a lot of financial impact that has been felt across the world. Lastly, I'd like to close by saying that certain economies that have for sure benefited also in rest of the world. For example, there's some countries that are able to get cheaper oil from Russia without getting the sanctions, such as India. And rather they're importing. There talks news about India importing oil from Russia, refining it through its refining sector, and then also exporting some of it, and so pocketing money and profits in that regard. South Korea's defense industry has benefited because a lot of weapons orders have been placed and ammunition orders have been placed to South Korea. So it's a very, very interesting thing that certain economies would also be benefited from this whole war. In these situations, they are not all losers. At times, there's certain people who tend to benefit on the side. So that's the long and short of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sultan Ali Haider, for being a guest in our program today.
Thank you, Shabat, for inviting. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the economic cost of this war is rising and will keep rising with each tick of the clock. It is now up to the diplomacy, how the two sides try to settle this conflict. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.